you, Martin. Pleasure to be here. So, Muslims are a minority in England as a whole, but in some English neighborhoods, they are the majority. There's about 500 neighborhoods with 1,700 people where the majority is Muslim. White British people, conversely, are the majority in England as a whole, but in some English neighborhoods, they are a minority. Muslims remain a minority in all English cities and towns taken as a whole. At neighborhood level, however, they are sometimes the majority. For this research, I have visited diverse English inner cities from the Yorkshire town of Halifax to Birmingham in the West Midlands and further to the East End of London. For all their diversity, these inner cities have an important feature in common. They are sites for what we may call majority Muslim relations in Muslim majority contexts. In the specific case of Birmingham, where there is no majority, we may say simply relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. On a personal level and as a researcher, it has been a real privilege to speak with residents and learn not only about their experience, but also from it. Many have tough lives, but unlike many of us, they have firsthand knowledge of how it is like to live in or nearby a Muslim majority neighborhood. They are the experts. For good and for ill, we have much to learn from them when it comes to forging relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. When I interview a resident, I therefore leave it for them to determine what issues in their view are most salient for community relations. To the extent possible, I avoid projecting external expectations. Public discourse might lead us to expect, for instance, that residents should talk a lot about terrorism and radicalization or racism and Islamophobia. However, I have found this hardly the case. Rather than discussing hot button issues like radicalization and Islamophobia, most residents refer to issues arising from their lived experience. Let me illustrate this with some textual statistics. In hundreds of pages of transcripts from 65 interviews, racism occurs 150 times, terrorism 17 times, 17. Islamophobia 15 times, 15, and radicalization 9 times. By comparison, police occurs 291 times, children 415 times, work 513 times, and school more than 600 times. Mosque occurs 277 and church 156 times. Houses of worship are clearly important, yet even combined, mosques and churches come up less often than schools. But still they come up a lot, probably much more than if I were interviewing people around, say, Oxford. What does that tell us? Majority Muslim relations in Muslim majority contexts are not so much about what people believe or where they worship, or even less about controversial issues like racism and Islamophobia or terrorism and radicalization. Rather, they are about mundane neighborhood stuff, like working, raising children, and sending them to schools. If local residents find that these are the issues that are most relevant to themselves and community relations in their area, who are we to tell them otherwise? To capture the diversity and intricacy of community relations, we consider 3 Muslim majority neighborhoods in different parts of England, each representing a typical constellation between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. My first case is Park Ward in Halifax, West Yorkshire. This North English region, West Yorkshire, has some of the oldest Muslim communities in the country and comprises cities and towns like Bradford, Huddersfield, and Dewsbury. Halifax is a town of around 80,000 inhabitants. The majority of residents are white British, mostly from working class backgrounds. There also is a significant ethnic Pakistani minority, mostly originating from the Mirpur region in Pakistani Kashmir. All mosques are located in one neighborhood called Park Ward. One generation ago, almost all Halifax Muslims lived in Park Ward. In recent years, however, many have moved out to adjacent areas. Levels of deprivation are high, with Muslim majority Park Ward among the top 1.72% of the most deprived wards nationally. An adjacent white working class ward has comparable levels of multiple deprivation. So you have deprived communities on the Muslim and non-Muslim side. For my second case, I select Shadwell in what used to be London's East End, now also known as Tower Hamlets. The East End is the capital, quote unquote, of British Bangladeshis, most of whom hail from the Sylhet region in northeast Bangladesh. Shadwell in particular is a good place to observe majority Muslim relations in a hyper-urban setting, contrasting with Halifax, where inequalities are very high compared. Shadwell is a deprived area where most residents are Bangladeshi and live in social housing. North of Shadwell, the iconic neighborhood of Banglatown is undergoing gentrification. On its south, a busy road separates Shadwell from St. Catherine's Wharf and Wapping, two upmarket neighborhoods along the River Thames, where Muslims are in the minority and where affluent urbanites are displacing the remaining traditional East Enders, most of whom are quite elderly. On the east-west axis, Shadwell is sandwiched between the City of London and the business district of Canary Wharf, with their glamorous skylines of banks and office towers. The East End offers a marked comparison and contrast with largely bicultural Halifax, where the most visible communities are deprived working-class Pakistani Muslim residents and equally deprived working-class white British residents. This is a map, and you see mosques and churches much wider spread and also overlap between them. And some synagogues you can also see. My third case is Lozells in Birmingham, the second largest English city. Lozells is the third most deprived ward in Birmingham, which itself has a high level of deprivation, contrasting with London, where deprivation is lower by comparison. In Halifax and Tower Hamlets, the dominant Muslim communities are British, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi, respectively. In Lozells, there is no single dominant community, although there is a Muslim majority. Ethnic Pakistanis and Bangladeshis make up around 30% each, around a third. Other significant minorities are African Caribbean, Black African, and Middle Eastern. Less than 10% are white, and less than 5% are white British. Lozells has numerous mosques serving Pakistani Muslims, Bangladeshi Muslims, Somali Muslims, Sudanese Muslims, and so on. Lozells also has a number of vibrant churches serving mostly Black congregations of Pentecostalists and the so-called Prosperity Gospel, but there is also a Church of England congregation, small. In the area surrounding Lozells, the composition of mostly Asian and Black minority populations varies, but in all cases, there are few white British residents, literally in the single digit of percent. In the 2011 census, Birmingham had a shrinking white British majority of 53%. In the 2021 census due to be published, Birmingham is likely to come out as minority majority, so no majority left. What you can see from this map is really the diversity of different faith houses of worship. Apart from mosques and churches, you have two gurudwaras, you have a Buddhist temple somewhere, you have a Masonic hall, you have a Hindu temple, you name them. So if anybody wants to study interfaith at a grassroots or street level, Lozells would be a very good place to go. In my previous work on Hindu-Muslim relations in India, I have mostly interviewed elites. Although I did speak to lower caste people in a slum in Mumbai, as well as Dalit students at a university in Hyderabad. In this research, I repatriate my research on majority Muslim relations to England, asking similar questions about relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in a country where Muslims are a minority. So that's common between what I did in India and what I'm doing now. This time, however, I am able to rely on street-level fieldwork rather than elite interviews, speaking with people from all walks of life, not only in Muslim majority neighborhoods, but also in the surrounding areas. And talking to Muslims and non-Muslims, and the non-Muslims can be white and the non-Muslims can be black, and so on. And the Muslims can be Asian and they can be African. During our conversations, I leave participants free not only to define what issues they consider most salient for community relations in their area of residence, but also to determine their own ethno-religious identities. Religious or secular, Muslim or Christian, British or Pakistani, Kashmiri or Scottish, Asian or black, or both or neither. One participant, just to give some examples, identifies as a Jewish East Ender, another as a British Muslim Bangladeshi, another as an Iraqi living in the UK, Black African, White British, Black British, South Asian, Asian English, and so on. So I ask them, how do you identify? I don't identify them from my end. Self-identification is important because majority Muslim relations will look different to you depending on how you identify, for example, by ethnicity and or religion, British Muslim or British Bangladeshi. Muslim participants refer to religion as part of their identity more often than non-Muslim participants. This is a very consistent result from the conversations. And to give you a bit of a flavor, and I think it's just an amazing story for what experience could be, I just picked one really remarkable individual. Let's call him Saqib. And he identifies as a British Muslim. So I would say a British Muslim in the Rotary Club up in Halifax. Saqib lives in Bradford, but works in Parkwood, Halifax. He was born in Bradford in 1970. He spent his childhood in Pakistan and then returned to Bradford with his mother. From the age of about 16 to 27, all the way through university, Saqib led what he calls a double life, as a Muslim on the one hand and night clubbing on the other. He was a believer and went to Friday prayers, but describes his former self as a non-practicing Muslim. In his late 20s, Saqib joined the Islamic Society of Britain, originally a Maududist organization, which he presents as pioneering in terms of tailoring Islam to circumstances in the West. Saqib explains that many British Muslims, when in need of advice, and these are his words, ring up people in Pakistan or Morocco who do not understand their Western context. To this, the ISB, the Islamic Society of Britain, provides an alternative by focusing on Saqib's words, what is our context and how should we live our lives in the UK? Ultimately, Saqib is interested not so much in theology, but rather in an applied British Islam that will guide him on practical matters and in concrete life situations. He finds that without this, his ISB mentor, he could not have achieved what he has, becoming a member of a local Rotary club. Saqib's experience is in many ways unique, but his membership in the Rotary Club offers a window on the challenges a practicing Muslim may face when joining white British communal life in a small town. The club resides in a white working class area. Many of its activities revolve around meeting in pubs, planning and organizing charitable events, and conducting, or as they call it, marshalling them, what you see on the picture here. Saqib joined in 2014, presumably for charitable and networking purposes. Most likely, he also wanted to further his business interests. He is not judgmental towards non-Muslims, but he is anxious to preserve the integrity of his Islamic principles when meeting with them. Looking back on his experience, he comments, I have learned more about the practice of my religion in those years because the challenges keep coming up. Food, alcohol, pubs, and churches. And then we discuss those challenges in turn in the interview. Regarding pubs, the main challenge is that Saqib's fellow Rotarians patronize them not only to hold meetings and socialize, but also to drink alcohol. Saqib thought about this before joining the club and reached the conclusion that it is not a serious obstacle. And he says, as long as my faith is strong enough that I am not going to be tempted to drink, I can go. However, what to do when the time comes for one of his 5 daily prayers while he's sitting in the pub with his friends? Initially, during the summer, Saqib would step out to the car park for prayer, but he wondered what was he going to do in winter, so he raised the issue with the others. I asked if I can go to the corner. This has worked for everyone. Pub food poses another challenge for Saqib. When is a chicken halal? Some people at the ISB argue that European slaughter methods are clearly not sacrificial and similar enough to Islamic methods. So as long as there is no pork and as long as there is no alcohol in the food, a Muslim can eat it. But this, Saqib says, was a huge psychological step for me to take. I still have to ask all the time, for example, if the gravy has alcohol in it. Meetings end with a toast to the Queen, posing another dilemma because most people toast with alcohol. Saqib went to his mentor at the ISB for an opinion on what he should do. His mentor passed the request on to a leader at the organization whom Saqib calls Sheikh. Initially, the Sheikh said, a Muslim must not do a toast. Saqib was not happy with the answer, so they went back and forth. In the end, the Sheikh approved the request. Yet the practice of buying rounds remains a problem, as it involves not only buying alcoholic drinks for the entire group, but also going to the bar, ordering drinks and bringing them back to the table. As a Muslim, Saqib cannot do this because Islam does not allow giving people alcohol, administering it. His friends say he should not worry about buying them rounds, but this remains a problem for Saqib because he cannot reciprocate when they buy rounds for him. He asked them, please do not buy me anything, not even a soft drink, but that is also not satisfactory because it excludes him from an important element of sociability. Similar problems arise at the supper club, where as a Muslim, Saqib cannot eat pork or invite other people for alcoholic drinks. Especially at the Rotary Club barbecue, this has led to uncomfortable conversations. People would suggest various pragmatic solutions, but Saqib must turn them down because that would just be playing tricks with God, as he expresses it. Christian practices pose another challenge. Rotary meetings begin with a prayer. The others asked Saqib if he was comfortable with that. I can say amen to everything except when they call Jesus Lord and God, Saqib says. Sometimes they attend Christian services as a club. And Saqib says, some Muslims say you cannot go to a Christian service, not even a funeral, but I say you can. Some say you can say amen as long as they do not refer to Jesus as God, although I am still not 100% clear about it. Most say you cannot go to a Christian event like a carol concert because it is about glorifying Jesus as the Son of God. I have done it, but I am still not 100% sure. The popular fundraising practice of charity raffles is another issue. Typically, people donate attractive prizes such as hampers with food. Participants then buy a ticket with a number on it. If the subsequent lottery returns their number, they win a prize. Is this gambling? Here, the reasoning is that you are not buying your ticket to win a prize, but to support the charity. Saqib checked with his mentor at the ISB, who confirmed that if the intention is pure, participating in a raffle is fine. To be on the safe side and ensure his intention stays pure, Saqib will donate back anything he might win from a raffle. As all of these examples illustrate, it is challenging, but not impossible, for an observant Muslim to be part of white British communal life in a working class area. Saqib explains that for him as a Muslim, the challenge is, as he calls it, finding a middle path. Tradition is not the same as religion, he says. When you analyze things, you can do most of them Islam-wise. On the other hand of this equation, the local white British community and its notables must accept a new member who not only looks different, but also reasons and acts in peculiar ways. When Saqib became president of the Rotary Club in 2016 to 17, the members were all happy about it, but not everybody in the local community may have felt the same. And I quote Saqib, "During the first 3 or 4 years, people would hardly believe their eyes when I walked through the door as the only Asian or Black person in the Rotary Club, or when they saw me marshalling at Christian events. But now they have got used to it. They see me as part of the furniture. Others might still get the same reaction." Saqib remembers a mud bike event where he and the Lord Mayor, as well as their families, were the only non-white people. After the event, the other members of the Rotary Club told Saqib that they had discreetly escorted them because they were worrying about their safety. This seems to confirm that while Saqib's fellow Rotarians had accepted him, others still held reservations. Regardless, Saqib's presidency passed without upheaval. So that was a whole year tenure. With that, just a little bit on this, I'm writing a book about this, and this is essentially the book plan, where I try to cover all aspects of Muslim, non-Muslim relations or Muslim majority relations, both more general aspects in the first 2 chapters, and then more specific aspects in the remainder of the book. The specific aspects, they start in chapter 3 with mostly peaceful coexistence despite socioeconomic challenges. Is really more difficult perhaps when you rub shoulders in very narrow and crowded environments and a lot of people lead tough lives. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 then is about family issues, where people from all age groups, from children to, I couldn't interview children, but through their parents and other people, and all, when they told me about their childhood, I found out. People from all age groups striving for healthy bonds, where, you know, bonds without bondage, where there is not a dependency relationship, which is a challenge. And the community element of that. Then challenging aspects of inner city life, from drugs to gang issues in chapter 5. Whatever the participants felt is important and has a community dimension. So when they think drugs have a community dimension, they bring up drugs and we discuss drugs or gangs or speeding with cars or whatever they think it is, litter, rubbish. Chapter 6, segregation and mixing in schools. Then mutual recriminations in chapter 7, but always mindful also of positive aspirations that the communities hold. And in chapter 8, what is being done to make community relations work or to undermine them? I asked people what is being done to either make it work or to undermine it, and then whatever they would tell me, I would capture, and this is going to be presented in chapter 8. And then I have a running query. In most interviews, I would ask them when the opportunity arises, is Britain ready for a Muslim prime minister, which always throws them out of like, woo. And then it's very interesting to look at and also compare the responses from Muslims and non-Muslims and different secular Muslims, religious Muslims to this question and conclusion, of course, also in chapter 9. So far, I've got these 5 chapters down, and I hope to get it done by the end of the year, I guess. I'm really trying to write a very accessible book, scholarly, but more accessible than the books you usually write as an academic. I hope I can find a publishing house where it's also going to be affordable. So if anyone has an idea where I could go with it, come to me after the talk or drop me an email. I would love to hear from you, because I'm at that stage now with the manuscript where I have to consider where am I going to send it. In the remainder of the talk, the focus is going to be on education and schools. This was a suggestion from Martin. He thought that was going to be most interesting, also with view to whatever memories from Birmingham. So I'll present on education in the remainder of the talk. This is from the school in London, this image. So in principle, there are 4 possible constellations or scenarios of segregation and mixing in residential areas on the one hand and schools on the other. A representative scenario where school segregation simply reflects residential segregation in the area. White area, white school, brown area, brown school, to put it very bluntly. One participant put it that way. A problematic scenario where school segregation occurs despite residential mixing in the area. So the people live mixed, but then they send their children to separate schools. A perplexing scenario where the area is segregated. So you wouldn't expect a mixed school, but all of a sudden you look at the school data or you look at the schoolyard and you see that the school is mixed. And then a genuinely diverse scenario where the school mixing occurs in a mixed area, which, you know, where the school reflects the area and both are mixed. At comprehensive schools in Halifax, we find the first 3, but not the last scenario. So Halifax is really interesting for that reason, because it's almost like a laboratory where you can, it's secondary school level, you can study these scenarios. We find the first scenario in North Halifax, which is a predominantly white British working class area with a predominantly white British school. Surprise. The second scenario refers to a situation where residential patterns offer opportunity for mixing, yet schools are segregated. And this is the case in central Halifax, which has both the Muslim majority area, which is expanding with a mixed belt of several neighborhoods where you've got different levels of mixing going on at residential level, and then you've got more white areas as well. And the whole catchment area thereby is quite mixed, yet you got one school that is overwhelmingly white British and the other is overwhelmingly British Pakistani. And these are images from which I've just taken from the internet from these schools, where you also see that how the schools present themselves in photos, and you can see that. And the third scenario refers to the possibility of school mixing despite residential segregation, which is a bit surprising. This is the case in Sorby Bridge, a white British segregated residential area in the south of Halifax, where there is so much ethnic mixing at secondary school that the school does not have a majority, but only minorities. And this in an area, if you look at the primary schools, they are all 95% white British. So how does that happen? And I've done my investigation, and it is a bit the school where you end up when your parents don't do the legwork. So this school is very mixed, but perhaps not for the right reasons. Yeah? To put it very politely, I won't go much into detail, but I have a paper on that as well. While many would agree that the fourth scenario, school mixing in a diverse area, represents the most desirable constellation, it does not occur in Halifax at the level of comprehensive schools. It only happens in 3 primary schools out of about 30, nearby a park ward in these areas where the Muslim majority area is expanding into new areas, and these schools are becoming more mixed. And these are primary schools, and they are genuinely mixed, and there are only 3 of them. Otherwise, you really have a very high level of school segregation in Halifax. And residential segregation as well, if you remember the map where all the mosques, literally all the mosques are in one ward. And there's about whatever, 9 or 10 of them, and not a single mosque is somewhere else. In the East End of London, we see a combination of the 3rd and 4th scenario. On the one hand, there are 2 Bangladeshi segregated comprehensive schools where the percentage of Bangladeshi students is higher than among residents. So the percentage is in the 80% range, whereas with residents, it would be less than that. Either of these schools has a small percentage of African, but hardly any white British students, literally 0.2% in one case and 2% in the other. Deprivation is high. Students at the girls' school seem to perform better in GCSEs, yet boys are more likely to stay in education or enter employment, which is, yeah. On the other hand, there are 2 genuinely mixed schools in line with residential mixing in the area. So that would be the scenario 4 that we didn't find in Halifax. Shadwell itself is Bangladeshi majority, but the area, remember, is more diverse. In either of these schools, the largest groups of students are African, which includes refugees, 26 and 25%, and these are the largest groups in the school census, followed by white British in the 10s, any other white, including East European, around 10%. Then there are significant numbers of students from the Caribbean, less than 10%, but still significant, and other minorities, whereas Bangladeshi students are underrepresented with just 7% in one school and 30% in the other. Deprivation is less high than at the Bangladeshi segregated schools, is not low, but less high than in the Bangladeshi segregated schools. And as with those schools, students at the girls' school, one of them is a girls' school, the other is a boys' school, very conveniently, so you can kind of compare a bit. The girls perform better in the GCSEs. However, unlike with the Bangladesh segregated schools, this then also translates into the girls more likely to be staying in education or entering employment. And in the Bangladeshi segregated school, it's the other way around. Finally, in the Lozells area of Birmingham, we mostly observe the genuinely diverse scenario of school mixing, reflecting residential mixing. So all 3, there are 3 comprehensive schools, all 3 of them in this area have a British Asian Muslim majority. In the first school, the largest group is Bangladeshi, followed by Pakistani, together 70%. In the second school, the largest group is Pakistani, followed by Bangladeshi, together also something like 72%. But then you add Indians, which may be Muslim in this case, may or may not be, we don't know. Either school has some African, but hardly any Caribbean students. And the third school has fewer Pakistani and Bangladeshi, but more African and Caribbean students. So the mixes vary, but they are really diverse schools. Exam performance is better at the third school, especially compared to the first. Levels of deprivation are high in all 3 of them. And given residential realities, it's not surprising that white British student numbers are low, 1%, between 0.2 and 4%, depending on which school we're looking at. So they are Muslim majority, but the mixes are different. And having presented this, and I'm not going to drill down more on it because it's a bit confusing in the talk, let me focus on the experience more of people going to such schools. And I will present it through generations because I've talked to people who are now perhaps in their 60s, but they went to a school at a time when perhaps the first Muslim students were going. So it's we're now looking at the experience of students going to this type of inner city schools. How do students experience community relations in some of the schools discussed, and how has their experience changed over the years from generation to generation? As we shall see, it was hard for the first generation of children of Asian Muslim immigrants to attend school at a time when Asian children were a small minority and when they had to endure a mix of prejudice and ignorance from their peers. When the percentage of Asian Muslim children increased in certain schools, victimization gave way to a more combative attitude, experienced as empowering by some, although perhaps at the expense of others. Today, it seems likely that some schools where the majority is non-Muslim still feel less than welcoming to Muslim students. Some schools where the majority is non-Muslim. However, such schools are uncommon in and around Muslim majority areas where few Muslim residents would send their children to such schools because there are Muslim majority schools available. One of the drivers of segregation is that then this becomes an option. Conversely, in and around Muslim majority areas, there now seems to be a risk of reverse discrimination against non-Muslim students at Muslim segregated schools. A British Bangladeshi community activist in the East End of London sees white students as potential victims, but the same, and I add that, but we'll see it later, the same may apply to children from other non-Muslim communities such as African Caribbean children in Los Angeles or East European children in Halifax. And I quote this Muslim Bangladeshi participant. And he said, in the 1970s and 1980s, the Bengali children were the minority. The majority were indigenous white children. There was institutional racism against Bengali children. Now, he says, it is going to the other extreme. Many white kids do not feel safe. The local authorities and the education department must be careful that what happened to the Bengali community in the 1970s and 1980s does not now happen to children from the English community. We do not want anyone to feel threatened by anyone else or any community to feel less than any other. To probe deeper into this transformation, we first hear from Joerg, a British Pakistani woman living in Halifax who went to secondary school in the 1970s, when I was a baby. When the first sizable cohorts of Pakistani children were going through the English education system. So she was a secondary school age child then in the 70s. We then hear from 3 men who went to secondary school in the 1990s at a time when Asians were starting to become dominant at certain schools. Hassan, a British Pakistani living in Halifax, James, an African Caribbean living in Birmingham, and Rashid, a British Bangladeshi living in the East End of London. Finally, we return from male to female students and discuss the experience of girls at Asian segregated schools from the 1990s onwards. So starting with Joerg. She is around 60 years old and lives in a middle-class area of Halifax. Her father belongs to the first generation of migrants from the Mirpur region of Pakistani Kashmir and took her to England when she was a little girl. When Joerg joined primary school, there were only between 10 and 20 children of Pakistani origin, many of them born in Pakistan in the whole of Halifax. At the end of primary school, all children in her cohort took the entry test for grammar school. Unlike her Pakistani friends, Joerg passed the test and joined a grammar school where there were only 3 non-white students in her entire year group. Not only did Joerg miss her friends from primary school, she also felt unwanted. She remembers that other children would trip her up and say offensive things like "Paki, go home," or make comments about her being brown or black. They did not make any comments about her being Muslims, she emphasizes, because nobody knew then. People were ignorant about Islam. Even the Muslims in Halifax had a relatively low level of understanding. The first mosque was just about opening at the time. So they did not make comments about her being Muslim, as people knew little about Islam at the time. The abuse stopped only in the final 2 years when Suat attended a middle-class school. Coach's manners, she says, came in. People would not say it. They may or may not have thought it, but they would behave. There is something to be said for that. It does reduce the abuse. So it seems to be referring to middle-class people being too polite to express their racist attitudes. Now, Hassan, a British Pakistani man, is around 20 years younger than Soat. By the time he went to a comprehensive school in Halifax in the 1990s, the situation had changed drastically. The school had a majority of white British students and a substantial Pakistani minority of 20% when Hassan joined and around a third when he left. Hassan describes his experience as that of an underdog who, thanks to communal solidarity, managed to reverse an initial situation of oppression and become top dog. Initially, Hassan found the environment at the school hostile to himself and other Asian students. And he says, "We were beaten up at school because we were Pakistani. My sisters got their Qurans hit out of their hands." Hassan remembers what he calls racist or gang fights, where groups of around 30 Pakistani boys would fight against groups of around 30 white British boys. The fights must have been quite violent. Hassan says, "We would fight with anything that was lying around: kitchen glasses, knives, spoons." While the experience was certainly unpleasant, Hassan notes with satisfaction that his side rose victorious. When he and his friends were gaining the upper hand, Hassan claims their white British rivals called in family members. And he says, men who were 30 or 35 years old, I suppose, parents, would try to beat us up. People said, "Black bitch" to my mom when she came to pick me up. At that point, Hassan and his friends started complaining with what he calls their elders. The elders in turn decided to intervene on the children's behalf. That's when it stopped. I could hardly believe what I was hearing, so I asked Hassan to repeat it for me. And this is what he said. When the white kids were losing, they called in family members. They would beat us up wherever they could get us. We were like, "This is not fair." I told my uncle, others told their brothers, others told their dads. They all joined the fighting. I asked Hassan if the standoff ended through violence or if there was some form of negotiation. He told me with pride that the generation of his parents won in the fighting. There was no negotiation. We were getting straight violence and abuse, so we gave them a taste of their own medicine. They got scared and then it stopped. It was good. I asked Hassan if, okay. So today, moving forward in time, only a third of students at Hassan's former school are white British, despite the fact that the residents of the area are more than 90% white British. So this is the school from scenario 3 mentioned before. Another third today in the school is Pakistani, and the final third consists of various other communities. Hassan is ambivalent about the direction his school has taken. On the one hand, he finds that the white British exodus was unprovoked. They should not have left. They do not like to integrate with us, interesting turn of phrase. Then they blame it on us for not integrating. Look at me, I am dressed like a white person. The only thing I do not do is sell my religion. On the other hand, Hassan finds that his own community should be more welcoming towards other minorities. He remembers speaking to a group of Asian students at his former school about the current situation. They said, "You don't want to go there, it's shit." I asked why. They said, "Lots of East Europeans there." I found that surprising. Why is it shit? I got no answer. I think that deep down, they just didn't like them. You know, they are uneducated, and being kids, they just said it's shit. But they, referring to the East Europeans, they are migrants as we were. What's shit about that? Around the time when Hassan went to school in Halifax, James, an African Caribbean Christian, went to secondary school in Birmingham. James told me that during his and his siblings' years at the school, it went from 50-50 to 97% Muslim, which seems like perhaps a bit an overestimate, but I haven't checked the figures for the past. James claims that when he joined, the share of Asian students in his year was above 90%. And I quote him, parents would move their children out and they did not want to send their children there. Once or twice a year, there was and these were the words, there was a race war where we would be picked on by the Pakistanis and the Bangladeshis. There were times when it was 100 against me and my 5 friends. The only thing you can do is all non-Muslims banding together, and so it was in my friendship group. We needed to do that for protection and to get safely through those years. To complement this in a different context, which I cite in a different chapter, there is also Bengali against Pakistani British clashes in the same schools. So the alignments vary, but James certainly describes a very uncomfortable experience here. A few years later, from the mid-1990s, Rashid, a British Bangladeshi living in the East End of London, went to a secondary school that was going through a similar transition. Rashid recalls that until around 1990, so 5 years before he joined, the majority of students had been white and black British. When he joined, the majority were already Bangladeshi. Today, 80% of students at Rashid's former school are Bangladeshi, 1% Caribbean, 0.2% white British. In this situation, Rashid showed remarkable kindness to someone struggling to fit in. And this is from the interview. At secondary school, I had a white British friend. It's a shame that I have lost track of him. He was honest with me and told me that he felt uncomfortable because there were too few white British people in the school. I would have felt exactly the same. Fortunately, hanging out with me and meeting more Bangladeshi Muslim friends made him more comfortable. Now moving on to girls. For them, the experience can be different, it seems, from boys. While it seems that segregation between girls can be intense, I have, for example, not heard of any fighting comparable to what Hassan and James recollect. Jane, a white British young woman living in the names are all not real, yeah. Jane, a white British young woman living in Parkwood, Halifax, who graduated from secondary school around 2017, remembers a high degree of segregation between British Pakistani and white British students at primary and secondary school. In her recollection, friendship groups were, she says, usually majority white with a bit of Muslims, but never majority Muslim with a bit of whites. Aisha, an Asian British young woman living in Lozells, Birmingham, recalls that the schools I have been to, like almost every school in the area, were majority Muslim. I haven't come into contact with many non-Muslims, which is entirely credible given the figures. Also in Halifax, I heard of a white British girl who had many Asian friends at primary school and therefore wanted to go to an Asian majority secondary school. The mother, whom I interviewed, feels she had to say no because she, the daughter, would not have been able to go out with her friends once she got to the age of 15. You've got, the mother says, you've got to think about these things when it is your child. When I asked the mother to explain this a bit further, she responded that she and her husband were looking for their daughter's best interest. When she was 11 years old, she would have had a lot of friends, but when she was going to be 16 years old, she would not have been able to go out with them. She would have had to find other friends, white English friends. The parents anticipated that while Muslim parents were allowing little girls to play with other children on the street, they were going to seclude them as teenagers. To prevent their daughter from becoming isolated, they prevented her from joining the Asian majority school. The mother says she did so with a heavy heart. She said, "It is a really horrible thing having to do that." And finally, Nadia, a Pakistani heritage young mother living in Park Ward, finds that the situation in Asian Muslim segregated schools is particularly difficult for girls. And this is from a mother sending their little children to the school now. And she says, a lot of Asians like to send their children to segregated schools where there are more Asian students and less mixing. They allow the Asian boys to bully the girls. For reasons that are unclear to me, Nadia believes that bullying is less severe in white British majority schools and that people from the white British community are more likely to tackle the problem. I have no idea whether this is the case. I'm just reporting it. So now, wrapping it up, while the accounts reported are highly personal and subjective, every single one of them, of course, cumulatively, they suggest, to me at least, that we should not freeze anybody, and least of all entire communities, in a state of permanent perpetration or victimhood. Today's victims can be tomorrow's bullies and vice versa. Indeed, the same person can be victim in one situation and bully in another. That said, it is important to remember, as I said at the beginning of this section, that we have been discussing schools in and around Muslim majority areas. Of course, in most parts of the country, Muslims remain a minority. And in those situations, there will almost certainly be cases, we know that, where Muslim students experience discrimination in the context of their schools, perhaps not very much unlike what Joerg describes from the 1970s, although perhaps there has been change. And that would be another research project to see how that has changed. This research is about these Muslim majority contexts, and then in and around them, how community relations unfold. Thank you.